We try to answer a lot of the questions that have been raised over the last hour or such, especially beginning from Ajay's opening address, in that we wanted to understand that if we look at public procurement en masse and not sectorally, where can we try to improve public procurement here in India, right? And so I don't need to sell why procurement is important to this audience, but generally it's an important issue. It's a big issue. It constitutes some 12% of our GDP. It outlays 17% of union expenditure, so on and so forth. What we saw was that at least internationally, India was being lauded for its procurement practices, if not being at the upper echelons of procurement, but it is still ranked well by whatever international benchmarks we could see. This is especially the latest benchmark by the World Bank in 2017. So we had a hypothesis that while procurement is doing good on paper, issues persist in practice. We thought that procurement is good on paper, but not in practice as such. And of course, many in this room have written on what is going wrong in practice. Now, the elephant in the room is the most recent CAG report, which goes after a lot of agencies and criticizes their procurement practices, including the NHAI, which is also the entity that we study in this paper. But the idea is not to look at a particular entity and say what is going wrong. The idea is to say what is good procurement, and then see whether NHI or any other body is doing good procurement or not, right? So we try to develop an evaluation framework for procurement, and it's largely similar to the previous presentation in that we look at the entire life cycle of procurement, which we found was relatively lacking in previous research, in that it would often focus on specific phases of procurement. So phase one, phase two, phase three, as Charmi had mentioned in the previous presentation, right? And to validate the framework, we evaluate NHI. So NHI is only a case study of the evaluation framework itself. And the reason we pick NHI is because it is the largest procurer in India. Its parent ministry, MORTH, has the largest capex procurement. And given that over the years it's gained experience, we also expect a learning by doing positioning of NHI to see that if you've learned anything since you've been doing procurement, and so it should be performing well, right? So how do we build a framework? We look at three international benchmarks, which are by the UNCITRA, the OECD, and the World Bank. And we see what are the common elements of these benchmarks, and then assess NHI on them. We supplement them with research done on assessing procurement. So we end up with 10 benchmarks in our evaluation framework. We can see them quickly: that transparency, integrity, documentation, capacity, timeliness, negotiation, monitoring, overruns or other avoiding overruns, dispute resolution, and payment, right? And of course, in the paper that supplements this presentation, we go into a lot more detail on what we mean by each of these. I will skip this for now because we sort of repeat them later, right? So how do we look at it? We see what is the principle, which is what I'll come to again to. So what do we mean by transparency? What is happening on paper? So if we are saying that we're good on paper, then what is happening on paper that is so good? And then what is the practice? So for NHAI, in terms of the position on paper, we look at three documents. One is the GFR, which is of course common to all, at least all procurement, public procurement in India. We have the so we have largely two contract models that NHI enters into, which is an EPC model, which is an engineering, procurement, and construction model, and HAM model. So it's a larger role for the state to play. And there are standard documents for both of these models. So the standard EPC document and the standard HAM document is what we look at, right? Then we rely on data from CPPP, which is the Central Public Procurement Portal, and CMI. And we look at a bunch of variables. So these are the 12 variables that we get from CPPP. We do these for 87 randomly selected variables since 2018 to 23. 2018 to 23 is when the data is, when CPPP provides us data. And for CMI, we go a little backwards and we look from 16 to 23. And we look at 495 projects by NHI in this period, right? So what do we see? We see that largely there are two models of contracts which are being followed, which is an EPC and a HAM model. A HAM model is being used for larger projects. On average, a tender would receive 8 technical bids and 7 financial bids. And this is close to what we would like for a road contract to be getting as well. This is what we have in the CPPP. We see from the CMI data, and I think it's beneficial to look at the cross section of ham and just the row of ham projects, right? So it has, we see that these contracts have gained favors, at least, which is also our understanding through conversation, since 2020-21. So where in the period to 2016 to 20, they formed 71 of the 288 projects. They formed 87 of the 207 in a smaller period, and you see EPC has gone down substantially in that period, right? So we'll go by the principles one by one. Again, I want to sort of emphasize that the idea is to stick to the principle and see that this is what we want to assess anybody on, and then we lay out what's happening at NHI. So in terms of transparency, we look at whether you're disclosing future plans. So what, at the beginning of the year, do you tell publicly what your procurement plan is? And do you and separately, do you conduct a pre-qualification consultation process? So what this includes is that before tenders are, the deadline for tenders is achieved, you sit down with potential bidders and see if there's any issue in the tender document, and whether that can be fixed, right? So GFR requires all ministries to publish annual procurement plans, and we see largely that this is happening just because it's a legal mandate to be done. What GFR doesn't do is to mandate the pre-bid consultation. It says that ministries and departments may hold consultation, and there's no mandate as such. And we see that NHAI has decided that this is not a fruitful exercise for them. So we see that in only 23% of the tenders in our sample, NHAI had a pre-bid consultation process. And when GFR says you may have such a process, it says it it gives a specific timeline on what it means the dates should be. And if we consider GFR's definition of what date constitutes the pre-qualification bid, so effectively 48 days by NHAI. So what we're seeing is that NHAI is saying, listen, you come to us with problems, we will sit down, we will solve these problems, all of it within 48 days. Then you give us another bid because on the basis of how we have revised our tender document. Right? Then we have integrity. So integrity is a little complicated. By our international standards, which is where we merge the 3 benchmarks, integrity largely means that there should be a well-defined criteria on the basis of which a successful procurer will be, successful bidder would be decided. In India, however, the state has sort of thought that it's beneficial also to have a code of conduct between both parties, right? So we look at both of these. And of course, because the model of code of conduct is by the Indian state, so if it's put on paper, there is an integrity pact in the GFR and a code of integrity in NHAI documents, both of which are binding on both parties to a contract, right? And of course, tenders mention criteria because that's a GFR requirement. But what is interesting is that despite having a position which is good on paper, a lot of things are going awry. So here is where the recent CAG report comes out as an example. So even though that report is in 23, about a month ago, we've seen reports since 2016 outlaying the process issues with NHAI tendering, leading to losses for concessionaires, right? And these amounts are not trivial. They can go into it. If I remember correctly, the largest is about 1,700 crores in one tendering process that caused loss to the state, right? And the recent, of course, issues have been in unverified experience certificates, not estimating the tender value correctly, which we'll come to in a minute as well, right? We also see that the number of vigilance complaints in procurement is rising since we have data. So from 2017 to 21, procurement-related vigilance complaints started growing as a component of NHAI's vigilance complaints in general. So NHAI might be doing good on other things, but on procurement, it's getting a lot of complaints. Now, why this is important is it's sort of an example to show that we have everything on paper. We have a code of, we have an integrity pact and we have a code of integrity, both of which are binding on NHAI. But even the CAG has, over the last 7 years, there's a specific section for NHAI in each CAG report has outlaid the problems, and NHAI has acknowledged it in its own publicly available data. Right? We then have documentation. In documentation, what we would expect a tendering authority to do is to give out detailed objectives of what it's going to procure. And again, because GFR outlay tells that entity should outlay what it's going to procure, and there are specific guidelines that you can't name a brand, you can't link it to a pre-existing product. All of these things are being followed because it's a legal mandate. What is not, however, happening is the documentation serving its purpose, right? And this is research that Shubha and Anjali had already done and is sort of supported by the numbers that we see, that all of the essentially all of the tenders in our sample have corrigendums issued to them. So you outlay a certain documentation and you come back and change that documentation. And so that while you might achieve the goal of a good description of a generic product, you still, the NHI itself is having to revise its documentation. And we see, for example, in ham contracts, which were 31 in our sample, all ham contracts in our sample had a retendering process, right? And I think Shubha and Anjali show that there were 30 corrigendums issued by NHI per project, which sort of outlays the number of times that NHI goes back on its documentation. So while the documentation may be good on paper, it's being revised multiple times to get to a stage that is acceptable to both parties.
Is it happening on the basis of a pre-bid meeting?
That is not called a corrigendum. So,
extension of time or extension of
yeah. So we don't capture what the change is because we haven't documented it in terms of number, but our reading of it shows that it's usually to extend time. To say that the bid will be open for so many days, you didn't get a bid, so you increased it by another 180 days or such. But that has to be a new document. When we have,
it will link to when we show the time
yeah.
on tendering. So part of the problem is that if you assume that NHI is an expert procuring body and has a lot of understanding of how road sector contracting should take place, then for it to make fundamental incorrect assessments on how much time it will take to tender an award is one of the challenges. So we'll see that again in the tendering timeline.
One of the things presentation doesn't achieve is to link a lot of these benchmarks. Of course, because capacity is low, documentation is poor. So it's not to say that these are all separate issues which have to be addressed separately, right? We then come to capacity. So the ideal is that you should have dedicated officers for procurement who have a tenure at the department, and this is just to sort of enable learning by again learning by doing, and they have the capability to estimate project value, which is what we saw in the previous presentation as well, that if the estimation itself is going right, there might be issues down the line. Now, NHI is structured to include a member for projects and two members for project, if I'm not wrong, and one member for PPP, right? So that all three of those members have dedicated teams below them, often going into scores of employees across the nation. So it's not even an HQ-based model. You'll often have PPP department in, let's say, an NHI, Chandigarh, so on and so forth, right? But what is happening is that a lot of time these positions are weakened. So for the last 3 years, there was no member PPP at NHI. And this results in a situation where it's inaccurate in estimating the tender value. Now, this is important because if we just slightly go back, we see that the CAG has recently pointed out that in PNR Infotech, the contract value was above the original estimate, right, by 17%. Because the original estimate itself is not working. We do see, however, that NHA is good at understanding work periods. And the reason we call it understanding and not estimating work periods, I'll come to in a second. So it's good at understanding work periods, not at estimating them. But it's not good at estimating bidding periods. So I'll clarify. How it's good at understanding work periods is because it sort of realizes that large.
Just a quick idea.
Yes.
Susan and others have been emphasizing a learning by doing process, which is reasonable, that every bureaucracy starts out clueless on how to do something, and then through repetition it gets better and better. So it is interesting and important to estimate the estimation errors of NHI over the years. So it should be the case that they get better over the years. And our second order public administration question should be to ask how certain bureaucracies learn better than others. So proposition 1 is to establish the extent, if any, of learning by doing. And proposition 2 is to ask how institutional design caters to learning by doing.
Well, you would be amazed. I don't know whether you've done research. In Singapore, which is the best in contracting in the world, 55% of infrastructure projects are delayed and have cost overruns up to the tune of 30%. Estimating errors, you take example of Sydney Opera House, started with 4 million Australian dollars, landed up with 104 million. Scottish Parliament, 50 times increased cost. So, since I've served with NHIDCL, estimating errors happen because of hundreds of reasons. One of the reasons, obviously, is site forecasting. Thousands of things happen: land acquisition, site forecasting, various other things which happen. The aim is not that you have made a wrong error. The aim is that you should have a mechanism to contractually deal with that error without it leading to a dispute. That is what is lacking. And therefore, sorry.
No, I think that's important. And in fact, we see that the estimation error is not as significant, and it sort of helps us highlight edge cases. So the CAG reports a 17% underestimation of the tender value. We see that it's usually about only 4%, right? So of course that sort of puts the 17% in perspective and says there might be an issue here, but it also says that NHS is doing relatively well, at least in one area. Now, what I meant by understanding and not estimating work periods properly is to say that it understands that if it's a larger project, it will take a larger time to do, right? So if the value of the tender and the value of the contract is larger, they do understand that they have to sort of outlay a longer work period for it. However, this is still going awry in terms of overruns, right? So again, they're good at understanding, and this might be something, Ajay, to do with learning by doing, and we can sort of look at it year-wise. We unfortunately have only 4 years of data, but we'll still see what's happening there. But yeah, I think they've got a sense of what to do, but not how to properly do it yet, right? We then come to timeliness, and this will sort of go to a few previous slides. And here, by timeliness, we look at timeliness in the planning process itself and not in the work of the project. So it's not in the construction of the road and laying out a bot model or a ham model. It is how long did you take for the tender to be finalized, right? And of course, time overruns in planning indicate procurement. Project should ideally have a predefined timeline, which will prevent bottlenecks, etc. Now, in practice, we see that finalizing the project takes twice as long as that was what was theoretically thought of. So if NHA at the beginning of the process said we're going to take 122 days from today to get to the contract being finalized, it actually took it 244 days, which is exactly twice, to reach the contract. And the largest part here is in the opening to contract phase, which means that you've selected a bidder, but to enter into a contract with that person, it's taking you about 6 months on average, right? And now it's I don't think it's anywhere else in the upcoming slides, but GFR requires all ministries and departments to have standard form contracts where possible. And we've seen that NHI already has these for both EPC HAM. I also know that they have it for bot contracts. So it's it's not the best positioning to say that even though you have standard form contracts, what is taking you the largest time is to reach the finalization of that contract itself. Of course, one issue with this might be that the previous dates are not closing as early as we think they're closing because corrigendums were issued and they pushed the previous closing dates later. Right? We then have negotiation. Ideally, after a bidder is successful, there shouldn't be any negotiation between that bidder and the procuring entity on terms that should have been known to all the bidders, whether unsuccessful or successful, right? You shouldn't be changing the terms and conditions that were outlaid in the tender as a post-tender negotiation, right? Now, we see large internationally, these are not large. So what the World Bank benchmark does well is it also tells us a position in other jurisdictions. And we see that in most jurisdictions, post-bid negotiations is not permitted. In India, too, GFR says that it's not permitted unless there are exceptional and unavoidable circumstances, which is, of course, not defined. And it's possible that the 169 days we see here is symbolic of post-tender negotiations by NHA. Of course, we can't speak to that precisely. It's a conjecture what we have from previous data on the total contracting time. Then we have monitoring. If the tendering process has gone, if the initial planning of tendering process has gone well, there should be independent monitoring of the work itself, which is the rights and obligations of both parties, especially given the increase of HAM contracts, which outlays more responsibility to the state. So if the state is taking on a higher burden on itself, there needs to be a monitoring on what the state is doing during the process, right? Now, implementation is mandated to be monitored, but we see that this is very restricted in that both the standard documents by NHAI say that we will monitor the bidder, but it does not outlay any monitoring of NHI itself. In fact, the person who does the monitoring is called an IEM, which is an independent external monitor. And in, I believe it is the EPC standard document, it says an IEM bracket authorities monitor. So it is acting on behalf of the authority to monitor the bidder, but there's no equivalent check on NHI itself. Now, because these are processes run during the course of the project, we can't actually see how monitoring is going. But here, this is one example where the position on paper itself is negative, and so we don't need to look at whether things are going wrong in practice.
But the bidder monitored, wouldn't it, kind of include the NHI being monitored? Because when the bidder is being, or the successful bidder is being monitored, let's say the quality issue, whatever issue is being monitored, if it will throw up issues which are attributable to NHI.
So,
And I think they're then treated accordingly. So the bidder will typically not be penalized for an action or a delay caused by NHI. That will come out in the monitoring. So I agree that in principle you should have separate
We'll
buckets.
have to check for that. So
no, but the way I look at it is depends on whose harm are you looking at. So if NHI does wrong, it can either harm the bidder, which is the other contractor in the contract, or it can harm the public resources that it has to it. What CAG usually points out is that you gave too much extent. In fact, you were pro bidder to the extent which is outside the terms of the contract, and which then disfavored the amount you were supposed to recover from the bidder. So you're not monitoring CAG NHI in terms of what it was supposed as a check on the bidder itself. So NHI is not conducting itself properly to the bidder, and that's why where the issues are happening, which is something. So one is that angle, and the second perspective, of course, towards the bidder, I agree largely NHI would be checked, but it still has responsibilities of land acquisition, payment, which might not turn up in terms of the bidder.
Challenge is that because we have moved to these models where the primary risk now resides with the state, and there's very limited risk that is residing with the bidder. So quality, of course, but the entire approvals, acquisition, all that sits entirely with the state. And the thing is, while it may not penalize the bidder, on an overall basis, it affects the procurement outcome. So I think there's some data.
Sorry, it's the other way around. Okay, and in phase one, NHI did BOT. That collapsed totally, and that's how
PPP
the phase.
also.
And that's how, incidentally, this terminology-wise, HAM, BOT, both are PPP. They're part of PPP. And there's only two models that NHA is adopting: PPP, which includes HAM. HAM is just a financing model, which includes BOT, and the second model is EPC. EPC means government constructs, and then they do BOT and get recovered. Now, in phase one, NHA did all PPP BOT model. It collapsed because of poor risk sharing. Land acquisition with the contractor, forest clearance with the contractor. Result: 80,000 crores of claims. NHA has already lost 20,000. Right now, in the second model, there is a issue, as you're saying. NHA is not monitored for the simple reason, like I worked in Dubai or in Kuwait. You must have all heard of FIDIC contracts. Now, in international contracts, the so-called engineer, contract administrator, is supposed to be a neutral guy. In India, he's the agent of the employer, right? So, in effect, many courts have already rectified this by saying that the independent engineer will be paid equally by the employer and equally by the contractor. That's in the model concession agreement of NHI also and ports also. Now, the problem that happened is something, it is not what exactly you're going on. I would put it in the other way around, that biggest lapse that NHI or all government agencies faces, why are they not able to select the best bidder, what in Europe is known as MEET, most economically advantageous tender? Because unfortunately the root cause is CAG only. Why haven't you selected the L1? MEET means you put adequate. I work with Highway England also. Now, Highway England, for example, has a system called early contractor involvement, and they have a target cost sharing, pain gain sharing. Early contractor involvement means you get contractors based on only quality, no cost parameters, because you haven't even finalized the project, and then both the contractor and the employer, the British Highway England, sit down together, come to a target cost, and after that target cost, whether saving or ahead, is a 50-50% pain gain sharing. It's called ECI, early contractor involvement with alliance contracting. But that needs a very, very high level of trust, other things, because quality parameters can always be manipulated. So those are the problems. One biggest problem is that NHI is constrained with L1 tendering. That is one of the biggest problems. L1 tendering will always have usual problems. Now government has allowed QCBS, but people are afraid to use it. 30/70 principle. And second is, I would frankly take CAG observations with a huge pinch of salt. We saw 2G, presumptive loss, actual loss was nothing, right? So there are huge lot of constraints which is happening not only in NHA, highway England. Take the case, you have a phenomena, those who have studied economics, called optimism bias. Ministry of Transportation UK has taken on something called reference for class forecasting. Everybody in NHI is aware that you need 3 times the tendering period than what you are actually giving, because the contractor has the risk of ascertaining site conditions in EPC contract, not the bidder, not the the agency. But unfortunately, political constraints. कब tender हो रहा है? जल्दी करो मुझे announcement करनी है, tender हो रहा है. That is a big problem. So constraints are well known, and cost overrun, I would really suggest that have a look at the study of how Highway England or other agencies resolved. Poland, entire NHOA program collapsed from between 10 to 14, and the minister was fired. It's called GDDKIA, is NHOA Poland. If you can compare with some other international program, even highways or any other, you will get a better insight of where problems are being faced. And surprisingly, the problems are identical in UK. Only the thing is that in UK they have managed to resolve it better by going in for a method which is very advanced and which does something totally different, which our government can't even think, which is basically a partnership mode with the contractor. And their contracts are also called partnership alliance contracting. They have a volume of contracts called NEC, new engineering contracts, which is alliance contracting. So problems all across the world were exactly the same which NHI is facing. And as he rightly pointed out, NHI is on a learning curve. And the biggest problem with NHI is that everybody is on deputation. There is no permanent cadre, zero. So that does have an effect. That is why Mr. Gadkari recently announced that we want to start a permanent cadre. So institutional memory is very short.
Yeah, I think one of the things that so I think one of the things that is perhaps not highlighted enough is that a lot of these are, they may not be necessarily the blame of NHI itself. Things are going wrong in the procurement process, and what we're trying to highlight is what should everyone be looking at when evaluating any procurement process. Where the blame or the solution lies is not something we explored at the moment, because the sell is not to say that NHI is doing horribly and you go and fix NHI. They say that, listen, these are the 10 things that every time you're looking at procurement, these are the things you should look at. And this is an expert procurer in India who has a large procuring base, and this is a baseline. So if NHI is doing has certain issues, of course we're going to face similar issues at other procurers. Right? We then get to overruns. It's fair to say that other bodies might have overruns as well, but that doesn't excuse the fact that NHI is overrunning both in terms of cost and time. And we see that in practice since 2016, close to 70% have had either a time overrun or a cost overrun, or both. And cost overruns reach about 90%, whereas time overruns are 53 and 39% respectively.
Mosby data is totally different.
No.
Open Mosby data is totally different on this.
This is CMI capping.
Yeah. So I don't know. Coincide this with this Mosby data, which puts cost overrun, which is not correct incidentally, in the tune of 15 to 20%, but for higher projects. So maybe you may like to have a look as whatever is correct.
You can do that, but from the CMI capex of 495, of course, there's a time base. There might be a time base issue. From 2016 to 23, we see about a 90% cost overrun in both EPC and HAM contracts. Right now, why this again? One thing to stress is that a lot of these metrics are interlinked. So, for example, a payments might be equally affected by a capacity in terms of processing. But payment is the issue we face with payments, where we expect that there should be clarity in terms of when will payment come, what will you do if it doesn't come, what is the procedure outlaid. The issue we face in evaluating this is that there's no publicly available data on what is happening at NHI regarding payments. And so we sort of believe there's a good governance aspiration to provide this data publicly. And on the other 9 benchmarks, NHI via CPP does provide us information. It doesn't do so in payments, and that's something that I think is just a recommendation we make in the paper. The last benchmark is dispute resolution, which might be the bulwark of all the other ones, because this is where you come to solve the problems of the previous 9 benchmarks, right? And if dispute resolution is working well, other things can afford to not do so if they come and be solved at a good and efficient dispute resolution mechanism. Now, we expect or would like that the dispute resolution mechanism outlays what will happen during the process. Will there be a stay on the procurement process? What are the powers of the court? Who can of a body? Who can approach this body? What will happen if this body passes a certain decision? Can you appeal it? Where can you go? What will be the time period for all of this? Now, this is the one place where the position on paper is silent. So, on the other 9, on 8 of the previous 9, we see that the position on paper matches our aspiration in principle, and GFR or NHI documents have a good position on paper. In dispute resolution, neither GFR nor NHI documents have any clarification on what will happen in cases of a dispute. The only way we are able to find anything out is a dispute resolution clause in agreements, which says that you will proceed towards arbitration in case of a dispute. Now, we know from other research that arbitration is not working just because the number of arbitration proceedings which are being challenged before courts. So 68% of NHS disputes before the Delhi High Court. So when NHS is before a High Court, it is usually there because there was a problem in an arbitration case and it's come to challenge that arbitration proceeding, right? And this is not, of course, our research, this previous research on this. And some of the work which is not cited in this, yes.
These are judicial decisions, right? On paper, where can you find what is the possible time frame for decision?
Incidentally, NHA today has the best dispute resolution model, which is now copied by Power Ministry and Port. That is reconciliation and settlement committee. So, firstly, arbitration judgment being challenged doesn't mean it's failed. Arbitration is compulsory, and if you please take the judgment, how many of these judgments have been overturned by the court? You will find less than 5%, because courts have very limited interference in arbitration. Why they have been challenged is basically, incidentally, they have been challenged by NHA themselves. Why they were challenged was mechanical. Typical government agency की मैंने पूरा effort किया है, so that audit does not say anything. You have not tried your best to fight till the end. So that's all. Arbitration has been successful to the extent 90%, 95%, because they have not been overturned by the court. And all that has happened by challenging is delay in the judgment. Now, reconciliation and settlement committee of NHA has been copied by court. I was with Mr. Gopal Krishna recently on a discussion on that, and it's excellently successful. And that is the model all government agencies now want to follow, which is Power Ministry also, where they have put expert people. And if you see my this thing panel discussion with Gopal Krishna, he openly says that what is happening in arbitration, unfortunately, is shopping of judges. Okay, that's happening in arbitration. And very common. I tell a guy, मैंने तुम्हें arbitrator रखा है, मेरे करना, otherwise next time I'll not select you. So reconciliation committee consists of 3 or 4 experts selected for their integrity. It's a mediation process. The time frame is fixed, and the best part is, and 90% cases coming to mediation, this reconciliation committee have been successful. And why they've been successful is because Mr. Gadkari or the same reports have said, we will not challenge this decision. We will implement this within 1 month. So a contractor's bill, let me tell you from my experience, generally claim is inflated to 2 times minimum. So claims have been brought down to almost 50% to their realistic value, and contractors have willingly done it. Why should I fight for 7 years when I can get within 1 month? And it's a huge, very successful, a unique model which is not there in the world at all. Reconciliation and settlement committee, and it's usually successful.
Where can we find data on this?
Reconciliation, I'll give you the ports data. There's a 1-hour video of mine with Mr. Gopal Krishna, which was organized by Calcutta Port Trust on FICCI. I was telling about international practice. Mr. Gopal Krishna is the chairman of Reconciliation Committee of this thing, 81 Shipping Secretary. So it's you can get data
We'll talk
for
to you
ports.
about
At least I can give you. Even NHAI rep is there in that panel discussion. You can get that.
Okay.
It's a wonderful model which is not replicated. 6 months for a dispute. 6 months for dispute khatam. 95% cases no challenge by the contractor or by the department itself. Everything resolved. Claims almost coming to 50 to 60% of what has been claimed. And there is another problem in arbitration which many of you will be knowing is that judges are paid as per sitting. I have seen a high Supreme Court judge being paid 10 lakhs per hour. So what happens is they have a tendency to prolong the arbitration because every sitting I am getting paid. In conciliation, the payment mechanism is a success model. Conciliation fails, zero payment except for your sustenance office 10,000 rupees din ka. And 6 months, nahi hota, please walk out. You'll see, find when I give you that video, take that video from me, you'll find Mr. Gopal Krishna speaking on this and telling you what a unique model. Ports very successful, highway successful, now PAR is copying it. So they've really learned on this dispute. And
How long have they been using this model for?
NHA, about 2 years now. 2 years now. Two, maybe a little more than 2 years. Ports copied from NHA, modified it, made it better, and they've been using it for 1 year. And in 1 year, disputes lingering for 15 years, 20 years have been resolved. That Mr. Gopal Krishna, once you hear that YouTube, you will find the data in that. So they've been very successful. Arbitration has been successful. It is just mechanical challenging. And the success of arbitration is not judged on how many has been challenged, how many have been overturned.
Yes.
95% have been upheld by the court because 34 can write any
We
challenge.
find that.
We agree,
We've
yeah.
done.
So on the reconciliation one, I think that's very important, and that's in fact part of the success story. And we look at it in more detail. The criticism of arbitration is not that NHA is doing anything wrong. Arbitration has been state policy, that's Niti Aayog documents, and the issue is that arbitration as a model has failed, right? So it is not for NHA to come and solve. So you're right that an arbitration proceeding will get challenged before the High Court. All of them will get rejected at the first hearing. We find that in a different study, which is not part of this. Most of the Delhi High Court civil litigation is a arbitration challenge. So it's not that it's coming only out of NHI, but it's the choice of arbitration, which may not even be dictated by NHI itself, which is the failure at this instance. And of course, we'll look at the how conciliation will work, and that is an alternative choice to arbitration. Yeah. Yeah, it depends on the
Dispute resolution that we are saying is that we don't need to think of dispute resolution solely from the perspective of whether the dispute got resolved, but also how long it took.
Yeah.
What impact did it have on the project itself? And I think some of that is important. I mean, if we say, for example, that arbitration was mechanically challenged and then after 4 years overturned by the Delhi High Court and the 34, and then subsequently 37 and another 4 years overturned by the divisional bench. Essentially, it added 8 years to the life of that bidder's.
No, it added only to the cost overrun.
Agree.
Not to the project, because arbitration happened at the end of the project. Right? So it added to the cost overrun. You're absolutely
and for
right.
the bidder. And for the bidder, because you have to remember that in high value procurements like this, there's a finite pool of bidders who are participating. And we need to ensure that the system of
bidder, yes, it's finances, yes.
there's
Because
a
he got his money
finite
late.
pool of parties who will participate in. Like, it's not like there are thousands of firms in the country who are participating in NHI bids, right? So there'll be a finite pool, and if we are saying that the mechanical response of state is to, dispute is to go and challenge, and for 8 years the party is stuck in court with that value, then there is a
that
bit
is
of
a
a
mechanical
problem.
response of private bidders also.
So we
It depends on in whose favor arbitration goes. It's a mechanical response in India. People only go for litigation to delay.
I think we're done.
Yeah.
Our presentation.
Yeah, we're done.
Exactly.
Reason be whatever.
फायदा किसको हुआ?
If it's not final, the arbitration, then there's a problem.
Yes, it is final in the sense that the decision doesn't get overturned. It just gets delayed due to litigation. And in fact, that is why reconciliation committee happened, because NHI and even railways, for that matter, realized that by delaying, I showed in one of my research how railways in an 18,000 crore arbitration cases landed up paying 6,000 crore interest component and 5,000 crore claims. So therefore, these people have realized that by challenging, they are actually losing because 7 साल के बाद interest देना पड़ता है 7 साल का, and that is how the reconciliation committee came into being.
So in fact, that is interesting, and we can talk about that separately because we've done a separate project on interest costs incentivizing stretching of litigation. So of course, you can stretch it out if you have enough interest cost to supplement.
So interest cost is where they are losing in arbitration. But let me tell you, other than few bidders who have happened to go into bankruptcy, like ILFS, bidders have generally not, had major problems. It is the NHI which has suffered because of the litigation. Because at the end of 7 years, bidders have got their interest, they've got their claims also.
So we are done with the presentation. If I, to conclude, in the paper, we stress a lot more on how we reach our 10 benchmarks. They are a component of 3 international instruments by the UNCITRAL, OECD, and World Bank. They're common elements of all these 3, which is supplemented by use across literature. And the goal is to provide a list of 10 benchmarks that can be used to assess any procuring entity in India. We start with NHI because of its large magnitude of procurement in the country, as well as our higher expectation of NHI than other authorities. And we hope that future research can build on, can use these 10, our evaluation framework for assessing other authorities.
Other areas.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Karan and Anjali. I think it was a good presentation, and I'm going to keep this short because a lot of it has already been covered. Thanks to Mr. with raising a lot of pertinent issues. Okay, so I'll start with some broad comments, then move to the assessment of NHAI itself, and then at the end, I'll just cover my feedback on the framework itself. So broadly, I viewed this framework as a means to measure irregularities. It could mean corruption, it could not mean corruption. And it nicely portrays the vulnerability of certain stages or points at which the NHAI is vulnerable to poor incentives on either side. The use of vigilance data was nice. I think we haven't seen much of this so far in work related to highways or infrastructure. However, to my mind, I feel that an evaluation framework should demonstrate the following. One, that it should be sector agnostic by nature. Second, that components that are critical for a full assessment should be part of the framework itself. And third, that it should be able to tell you whether a system is broken or successful, either way. And the fourth is optional, that you may want to even present solutions to improve or not. The biggest problem with the paper that I felt was that you are not justifying clearly the linkage between the principles and the metrics that you've used. So why are these particular metrics chosen above certain others that might come to my mind? So maybe if you are able to justify that better in the paper, it might help the reader connect why you use these metrics. Now I understand that the aim of your paper is might not be to tell a story about NHAI. It's to tell a story about your framework. But the success of the framework depends on whether it's able to assess NHAI in this case or not. And I'll tell you why this was a problem to my perception. Number one, the metrics that you've used are open to interpretation in different ways. I'll tell you why. So on pre-bid meetings, your paper itself shows that majority of the contracts are EPC. Now, EPC are low-risk contracts for the private sector. India has been doing EPC since the 1970s. I don't think we need pre-bid meetings for this. Was that EPC are low risk from the perspective of the contractor?
So I think we are on that path where we want to take the model EPC agreement and assess some of the metric quality. So that's an exercise that we are planning to do.
Okay, fine. Second, we come to the core agenda. And this is something that I began working with at FRG with Anjali itself, so it's very dear to my heart too. But but when we look at core agenda, what's more important is the subject of the core agenda. And like you said, time extensions are the majority.
So Charmi, I mean, I agree with you, and we have the data, and we will put it out. The only concern we have is that we see that the average number of bidders that 7 to 8
right,
and yet we see these time extensions happening.
So correct.
So
From our consultations, what we have found out is that people wait for the last minute to place a bid because they want to see who else has placed a bid. So very often NHAI procurement officials will be like, okay, ठीक है, 2 दिन में इनका bid आएगा, फिर इनका bid आएगा, तो हम 3-4 दिन और बढ़ा देंगे, 3-4 bid और आ जाएंगे, and then that helps them get a competitive price. Even if the difference is marginal, I feel like from a procuring official's perspective, he will take the delay over having to answer questions on cost. Yeah. Next, we come to estimation of contract values, and I think Sir also covered this quite well, that this is not a question about the ability of NHAI to actually estimate the price, but this is actually how competition plays out. And in EPC especially, because they are upfront payments for a particular service, this is the place where private sector also tends to undercut. So NHAI will put a price at 100, and because there are so many bidders, you will invariably land up at a price of 95 or 96, because this is where firms will undercut each other. As opposed to HAM, where there is some amount of financial risk that the private bidder also takes, so they don't undercut that much in this case. So it may not be about estimation capacity, this may actually be about competition playing out.
Actually, on estimation, our thing is that they in fact estimate the project value reasonably well. What they don't estimate well is the amount of time it takes for the tender to be over.
Right, and I would again link this back to maybe the core agenda, that if they know that they are going to get more bidders, they may find it easier to extend the time period than work with lower number of bidders. Okay, next I come to time and cost overruns. I don't know, so there is a bit of a difference in the way it was presented today versus how it's written in the paper. So time and cost overruns in the paper is presented as a problem of monitoring, but in fact you have time and cost overrun estimates because there is monitoring. So time and cost overruns don't occur in the monitoring phase. It's an outcome of everything that's gone wrong in the project right from day one till that particular point. So just check on how you've presented it in the paper.
I don't know whether it will be called monitoring. It's CapEx data, CMI is monitoring.
Yeah, correct.
I'm not sure whether
CMI and MOSPI are monitoring. So, yeah. And second, like Sir already highlighted, study the role of the independent engineer.
So you're saying that the presence of monitoring and the outcome of monitoring is segregated as two different things. That's what you're suggesting.
So in the paper, you say the time and cost overruns are a problem of no monitoring. So just go back to that and see it. And the role of the independent engineer as a monitor is in fact the most problematic part. So study that a little further. It will help the metric. Next, on payments being put as a last stage variable, again is a problem, because at NHAI you have, also so many models have payments that go in milestones, certain payments are made upfront. So
we clubbed it for now because of the issue of not having any data, whether that's interim or final. But you're right that in the sense that payment is a part of the entire process.
Yeah. And lastly, even for disputes, I think this has been fairly discussed already, that the fact that arbitration appeals are a big chunk of the disputes, I don't see this as a procurement problem, I see this as an arbitration problem.
But also
Yeah.
I would
So
say
then how does it figure in a procurement framework, right?
See, it figures because government has taken
The choice of
call.
models
It's the
problem.
choice of model. So government through the Niti Aayog, whatever, OM or whatever it is, has actually mandated that all government contracts should contain the arbitration clause.
Right.
It has chosen a particular way of dispute resolution, and then that dispute resolution mechanism functions poorly, and then government is
Right.
continuously appealing failures of that. Right. So it's a policy level problem more than a specific to one agency.
Okay.
What is the alternative? The alternative is civil suit, which is even worse. And that is why mediation bill is the alternative, which is now coming into place. Otherwise, if you didn't have arbitration, you would have had a civil suit, which is even worse because our courts are overloaded. At least an arbitration finishes in 2 years, civil suit finishes in 7 years. So therefore, between a civil suit and arbitration is definitely better.
Okay. All right. Just some closing comments on the framework itself. So I thought that you could improve the way your framework is presenting the assessment. by looking at it actually as a life cycle, because currently each of your phases look like an end in themselves. There is, if you could demonstrate how problems in phase 1 tend to have an impact all across phase 2, 3, then that would be a real life cycle assessment. Also, I think, through this discussion also we've discovered that there are so many elements of accountability and procurement officials itself that tend to place constraints on the procurement system. And I feel that the reason why this doesn't come out in the paper is because you only focus on legal frameworks and principles, and you don't bring in other elements that are important to the procurement process. Lastly, like I started off saying, that I thought this could be a useful framework to just study irregularities rather than all aspects of public procurement. So if that's the aim, then maybe that's what you should do. And also, in terms of the title of the paper, I think you should make it a little more specific than to say exploring opportunities for improving public procurement in India.
We are open, you give us suggestions. That was suggestion. Give us a better title. Take it, yeah. Copyright.
Okay.
She's the That's the whole point of discussion.
All right, that's the end of my discussion. Thank you.
Great note of data.